Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Portage County Library for the opening lecture of the 2013-2014 Community Lecture Series sponsored by the College of Letters and Science at UB Stevens Point. My name is Todd Good and I'm the Associate Dean in the college. And for those of you who are familiar with this lecture series, you'll notice two things differently to begin with. First of all, we've moved from Thursday to Tuesday nights. And secondly, the start time is moved up to 6:30, and that is to better accommodate the library staff so we can accommodate their closing time of 8 o'clock. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And tonight's speaker is Brad Mapes-Martins from the Department of Political Science. Dr. Mapes-Martins is an assistant professor of political science with a bachelor's degree from Evergreen State College in Washington and a PhD from University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Brad's research interests include examining environmental policy and political theory. And when he has spare time, he enjoys biking and playing soccer whenever possible. Tonight's presentation, as you can see from the screen, is I Foresee All Sorts of Unforeseen Problems, Climates, and Constitutions. It is my pleasure to introduce Brad Mapes-Martins.
Thank you very much. So I will first begin by explaining the title. I got a few questions already about it, and it's taken from a 1986 episode of Yes, Prime Minister. For the political science nerds out there, that will be a well-known show. For everybody else, I'll recommend it. But there's a great episode in 1986 where the Prime Minister's trying to pull this wonderful political maneuver to get a tax cut, but he's doing it by feinting to say he's going to ban smoking. And all the people who are fighting him on banning smoking run in and say, well, you can't do this. This is a disaster. This just can't happen. And finally, he, being the Prime Minister, is a very smart and witty man. He kind of backs him into the corner. And the only response they have is, well, I foresee all sorts of unforeseen problems. And of course, his response, such as, if I could foresee them, they wouldn't be unforeseen. And the reason I chose that as my title was because I thought it captured very well an interesting dynamic about climate change. If we think about one of the central aspects of climate change is it's about projecting into the future, right? It's about what do we know about the future. And as most of us have tried and probably failed to do, we don't predict the future very well. But we can't really make a policy without some idea of what we're getting into, right? Some sense of what are we facing. And so for me, this captured in what I thought was a very interesting way some important element about what's going on with climate change and climate policy today. But for now, what I want us to focus on is really getting a sense of where are we today in terms of where are we in a policy sense around climate change, and especially when we fit climate change into our views around the Constitution, right? When we think about how do you change a Constitution to accommodate the types of problems we're likely to see with climate change, what does that look like, right? What are the problems you're likely to face? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, you're probably familiar with some image sort of like this, right? Some sense of, here we can see from a projection from 1919 going into the present up in the top right corner. 2061, things aren't looking so good. There's a lot more red in there, a lot less blue. And by 2099, there's a whole lot of red. What that actually means, well, you'd need to run the computer models and understand those very well to make sense of it. But we all have some sense of, that seems a bit frightening. That seems like something we probably don't want to face, right? And the forecast can be incredibly frightening. So even if you haven't seen this image per se, maybe you've seen the recent film Chasing Ice, right? Beautifully done documentary looking at how it is that glaciers are melting at a very rapid rate. And there's been, most recently, on May 9th of this year, we reached an important milestone, right? 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere was measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, which I believe is a National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration outpost that they measure at. And these types of projections can be frightening when put into the type of timelines that we're talking about here. I mean, this is a very quick amount of time. And 400 parts per million, that was the first time that that number had been sort of recorded, and it wasn't recorded originally, but that's the first time that that number has been sort of seen in 800,000 years. Now, that's a lot of time. Most recently, projections done by Bill McKibben, a climate activist, suggest that we have about 550 gigatons left that we can put into the atmosphere before we pretty much seal the deal on 2 degrees Celsius change. Now, we can squabble with the ins and outs of those numbers, but if he's at all correct on that, that's a pretty frightening thing, especially when at our current rate, that's going to happen in 16 years. Which means in 16 years, we'll pretty much have locked in a 2 degrees Celsius change in our climate. Now, as a political scientist, I'm not here actually to talk about the sort of rightness or wrongness of climate change. I don't do climate science. I leave that to the climatologists. What I look at is how climate change impacts society, how climate change is likely to impact society, and one of the more interesting aspects for me anyways is how the conflicts we have over whether or not climate change is happening, whether those conflicts or how those conflicts influence society, right? And all of these impacts are going to alter what that picture actually plays out to be. So we'll keep that in mind. We're going to focus our attention on 2 basic problems. How is it, if a constitution is going to adapt to the types of problems posed by climate change, how is it that this is going to take place? And I say we're going to see 2 basic problems. The first, the need to rebuild what I'm calling a legal infrastructure. And I use that term without a lot of technical precision, but we'll define it a little better in a second. And the second thing is coordinating the relationship between science and democracy. And it's a relationship that we may think is very simple, but has turned out to be remarkably complicated. And adjusting it and rebalancing it is probably going to be even more complicated. So that's what we're going to look at today, these 2 simple points. So the first, rebuilding legal infrastructure. Right? Here I would like to recall Machiavelli's famous analogy that in the world of politics, right, trying to change a constitution, trying to change a political infrastructure, after you've drawn up a constitution, is a lot like trying to fix the foundation of a building. You say, you can do it, but you're risking the whole thing, right? You risk toppling the whole building. Now, Machiavelli has a bad reputation, but he also has quite a bit of insight on politics. And so we're going to look at what does this mean? How is it taking place today? So the first thing, how am I defining this? Right? What is it when I say a legal infrastructure? Well, for now, we're operating with 50 plus years of federal air legislation, right? Give or take. Right? We have the Clean Air Act, which is approaching, it's just crossed the 40th year. But there was some federal attempts at air legislation before that. We have, at this point, given all the gridlock in Congress, quite a bit of environmental policy has been picked up by the executive branch, which are now being handled through executive rulemaking. And that's been a bit of a source of instability. But that's where we're going to have to see some changes take place. Next thing, you'll have to deal with the fact that there are precedents on the book, right? New piece of legislation is going to have to deal with the fact that the Constitution has been interpreted and courts have spoken. And these things can't be thrown out as if they've never happened. So whenever some new case arises, it's going to have to contend with what we've already seen. And then finally, we have a well-established culture of individual rights. And in this case, we're talking specifically about property rights. Property rights have shaped a large part of how environmental legislation in general and climate policy in particular have been handled. So one example we can consider here for what might it look like to rebuild a legal infrastructure, right? We've seen already the kind of early changes taking place. Most recently, American Electric Power Company, along with a few other power plants or power producing companies, was sued by Connecticut and I believe 9 other states, mostly in the Northeast. And the suit involved claiming that the power plants were contributing through their carbon dioxide emissions to climate change, and that these states, in cases like Hurricane Sandy, were already starting to feel impacts related to climate change. So it's a bit of an indirect way to try to make a claim about harm, right? To say, we, as the state of Connecticut, are going to sue this power plant, this power producing company, because they use fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are emitted, right? They emit carbon dioxide in making them into energy. And so we're asking that this be deemed a nuisance. Now, the Supreme Court kind of nipped that in the bud. The Supreme Court, in a pretty rare moment, at least on an issue that had the potential to be an important environmental issue, the Supreme Court voted 8-0. Sonia Sotomayor had heard the case when she was still on the Second Circuit Court, and so she recused herself. But 8-0. So we have a unanimous vote. I mean, think of all the big decisions that have gone on, and this one clearly wouldn't count as a big decision because it was very obvious that they were not going to let this suit take place. The Obama administration had said, do not let this suit take place. But there's not a lot of other ways to deal with it. And so what happened was the court said, well, the Clean Air Act is already written. Any lawsuit that you want to pursue to go after these companies has to come within the framework of the Clean Air Act. Now, the Clean Air Act, mind you, was drafted in late 1960s, right, passed in 1970, and revised in 1990. That's the last time it saw a significant revision. So since then, Congress has not been all that great at getting things passed, and partisan polarization has increased. And along with that, the amount of legislation is at a record low that's coming out of Congress. So it's not likely that we're going to see the kinds of changes to the Clean Air Act that are going to allow states and individuals to pursue claims against companies that pollute, right, or companies that emit large amounts of CO2. Now, there are other ways in which we could try to adapt, right, to change or rebuild our legal infrastructure. We could just amend the Constitution, right, a very direct way of doing things. And this is a map of all the countries in black that have, as of 2011, recognized a constitutional right to a healthy environment. So this means in their constitution, it specifically says that their citizens have a right to a healthy environment. You'll note, or I would like you to note the absences. Note the white spots, which are nations that have not recognized this. And so this is one way of doing things. The second would be less direct. And that is, maybe you don't write an actual amendment for your Constitution. Maybe what you do is you recognize international laws that would allow citizens within your country to say, we have a government that recognizes a right to a healthy environment, even though they don't necessarily enshrine that right in the Constitution. And once again, you'll notice, the number did increase, but there's still a great deal of white spots out there. And one of the things we can take note of here is that we see the United States, in both cases, has not amended its constitution, which we can imagine why that might be, is it's a very difficult process. But Canada, China, Australia, that's kind of a unique little group. Right? What do they have in common? Why might they not have done so? And I'll get to that in a second, but the United States, anyways, is very slow to change its constitution. right? I mean, if we think since the Civil War, there have not been a dramatic number of amendments. Two of them, right, prohibition and the repeal of prohibition, cancel each other out. So we're really talking about 10 amendments since the end of the Civil War. We also see that in the United States, and this could be one reason why the United States has not acknowledged a right to a healthy environment, the United States actually does have a good track record on a lot of environmental issues. And partly because when it acknowledges a right, it tends to take it pretty seriously. I mean, we see that Russia has not only acknowledged a right, it also has enshrined a constitutional right. Russia is not a very good example of a place with strong environmental protections or strong environmental rights. If you've ever heard of Chernobyl, you may be reminded of why that is. They were very good, at least as the Soviet Union, at hiding a lot about environmental conditions. And so some of the Eastern European nations, after the fall of the Soviet Union, were very quick to learn from that experience and to say, we have a right to a healthy environment. We are not going to be the dumping grounds of the Soviet Union like we were before, right? Obviously, the Soviet Union's gone, but they took that to heart. But one other element to this story. This happens to be carbon dioxide emissions. And what we'll notice is there's a correlation here. The redder the country, that is, the more CO2 emissions per capita, the less likely they are to say, you have a right to a healthy environment. This is at least part of the background, right? This is at least part of the story as to how change has been so slow to come. So there are still other ways that we might talk about rebuilding our legal infrastructure, right? We might talk about, for instance, international law. International law offers an interesting pathway, right? Similar to what I just described, you can have a country that recognizes a right in a treaty, and in the United States, that has the same standing, right? Once it's been ratified by the Senate, it has the same standing as law. And that's a good thing. But one of the aspects of trying to deal with maybe promoting new international law as a framework for rebuilding legal infrastructure is you increase the complexity of the problem by a factor of about 200. That is, you're now dealing with far more nations, far more emissions. On one, and this is a photo taken from Copenhagen, and in 2009, this was sort of the last great chance, at least at the time it was thought of that way, right? That international law was going to be able to get out ahead of the problem of climate change. At the time, everybody knew that they